you know, let me go into a little bit of detail. I mean, the forensic evidence we have involves exit polls, it involves hand counts, it involves comparison with every baseline, pre-election polls, and in the, in all cases, without having everybody's eyes glaze over, there are large percentage shifts, and there have been since 2002, and it's always in the same direction. And for what it's worth, in 2010, I have the numbers on the Senate races. In this very last election, which of course was one of these great triumphs for the right, of all the Senate races for which exit polls were available, and I think there were 17 or so, they all shifted to the right relative to the exit polls, except Harry Reid in Nevada, who appears to be kind of running his own show there. All the others were either neutral or red shifted, what we call a red shift.
Meaning, just to be perfectly clear.
Meaning that the vote counts came out more Republican than the exit polls. And these exit polls, they've had a lot of time to stratify these things, get these things right. There's no issue about oversampling Republicans. They take into account the proportion of Republicans that are supposed to be in the sample. They weighted accordingly, blah, blah, blah. What is really telltale, probably the most telltale current data, current forensics lens that I can give you, is that polling in this country, polling is huge. That's what people rely on to tell them, at least in between elections, what's going on. Who's in the ascendancy, who has the momentum, what this country is, the portrait of this country. Over the last 10 years, there has been an evolution in pre-election polling, tracking polling. And this is whether it's run by CBS or ABC or Rasmussen or Pew or whoever, Zogby, anybody. And it started about 10 years ago that they started using something called the likely voter cutoff model. And usually that is enough to make everybody's eyes glaze over. Just the words, likely voter cutoff model. Oh my God, that's esoteric. Well, let me just tell you what it is. Basically, you go in, and in polling, it's the sample. I mean, if I took a sample of you guys, how Obama is doing, well, I'll take that one back. Took a sample of you guys whether, you wanted to see Scott Walker recalled, there'd probably be a very strong sentiment to see Scott Walker recalled. If I polled a room full of Tea Party Republicans, it would be against it. It all depends on who you sample. And the dirty little secret about polling is that sampling is very difficult, especially in the modern age where people have cell phones, people don't answer their phones, and it's very difficult. So it becomes something of an art. And if you just polled registered voters, it turns out, if you just polled the general populace or registered voters, it turns out that quite a few of the people you poll register their response and then wind up not voting. And in fact, disproportionately more Democrats and lefties wind up not voting. Why? Because they're poor, they're transient, they're students, they're younger, they don't have the established voting records that people living for 20 years in the same 22-room house in the suburbs have. So you have to account for that. So they came up with this likely voter cutoff model by which you ask a set of screening questions. And if the responses are not satisfactory, you eliminate the respondent from the sample. Well, some of these screening questions are things like, have you voted in the past 3 elections? Well, that's going to do great for the 20-year-old voter, the 22-year-old voter. Other screening questions, have you lived in the same place for the past 10 years? That's going to do great for your immigrant who just got their visa. That's going to do great for people who are transient, who are students, who are poor, and have to move from year to year. So you wind up with a room of people who live in houses for 20 years in the suburbs and vote in every election. It's way, way skewed to the right. And this is the model now being used to select the respondents for all these polls that you look at and you say, well, how can that be? How can Americans be voting against their own interests? How can they be so either stupid? How can they be so misled? What is going on here? Well, what's going on here is you're polling a skewed sample. And here's the kicker. That model gets elections right. It wins. That's why all the pollsters use it. because over the past 3, 4, 5 elections, they've been burned using any other model. For instance, a model that the New York Times used to use where you downweight voters if they're less likely to vote, if they don't respond to these questions affirmatively. So the likely voter cutoff model is basically what is otherwise known as a fudge factor. It's a tunable fudge factor that enables pollsters to get elections right. And pollsters stay in business when they get elections right, and they go out of business when they get elections wrong. It's not their job to ask why the vote counts are coming out the way they're coming out, whether they're being manipulated. I mean, it would take a very extraordinarily, not just ethical, but suicidal pollster to come out and say, well, I think my poll is right, and I think these elections are wrong, and all the other polls are wrong because the elections are being manipulated. Can you imagine, pollster coming out and saying that? The New York Times, Washington Post? I don't think so. So they kowtow and they adopt this model. So you have a model which is effectively a methodological abomination. Any, high school statistics person can tell you this. And it gets these elections right. Well, the only way it can get the elections right is if the vote counts are wrong, if they're shifted. But in the process, so this is like strong, it may be indirect, but it's very strong evidence because you're looking at a huge N. You're looking at all these polls. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of respondents. And it's telling you something about the fraudulence of the elections. But at the same time, it sets expectations, such when the election comes along and it matches the polls, everybody goes, well, that's what we expected in 2010, a Republican slaughter. And the exit polls and the pre-election polls are both, just to add to the pudding, are both weighted to demographics, including party ID, race, age, etc., which have pretty strong political weight to them in terms of what the voter's likely vote is going to be. They're all weighted to demographics drawn from adjusted exit polls. What are adjusted exit polls? They're exit polls that were altered to conform to the vote counts, which is what they do, in all the previous elections. And in the process of altering the who'd you vote for question, it passes all the way through the questionnaire, and it carries with it the demographics. So you wind up with more Republicans, because they had to add more votes for George Bush. And in the process, they added more Republicans. Just a slight oversimplification, not very much. So now you're looking at current polls, which decide how many Republicans and Democrats, et cetera, how many old and young, how many black and white and Latino, et cetera, are going to be in the sample based on figures from previous elections that only came about because they had to goose the exit polls to the right, always to the right, to match those manipulated vote counts. So prior manipulated elections make current manipulated elections look kosher because they distort all the baselines. So forensics people like me tear our hair out because they've taken away our baselines. Karl Rove is a pretty smart dude. And they figured out a lot of this, how to proceed. Now, is that speculative? Yeah, it's speculative, but it's coming from somewhere. Don't call him Karl Rove. Call it the mystery man. Whoever figured this out to implement all this. So we're in deep, 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 deep trouble. And the agenda of the progressive agenda, does it even exist at this point? I mean, it's turned into trying to fight off Scott Walker and not have him completely destroy unions. Is that any surprise? When you can put not just a thumb, but your whole foot on the scale of democracy, you can warp it in a big hurry. And this rapid change that's coming to America, that's very hard to explain, even in structural ways, even with the control of the media, even with Citizens United, all of which, by the way, kind of provide cover. There's a fraud, there's a theft, there's a crime that all our forensic evidence keeps pointing to. And yet, we cannot get it out as a story. And I mean, this is our job. Okay.